Welcome back to the And I Hate podcast, a forum to discuss and combat student hate. Today we are here with Gabe Rusk, someone I know as a judge on the National Public Forum debate circuit, but whose area of interest is the censorship of civil rights activists and members of marginalized groups. So hello, Gabe. Thank you so much for being on here with us today. And can you give a brief description of your background and kind of the work that you did with censorship and all of that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So, like you mentioned, my interest in free expression, and it's interesting you frame it in terms of hate, has to do from the legal and historical perspective.
Mhm.
So, in undergrad, I studied religion and philosophy in Colorado, and then I got my master's in Oxford, and I focused on legal history in the United States. And it really was about pluralism in the United States, or the lack thereof. And
Mhm.
my background was sort of studying the historical and legal obstacles that were preventing pluralism from happening and sort of the stakeholders and vested interests that were trying to stop it from happening. It started from a religious perspective, talking about why at the time there was obviously an emphasis on Protestantism in the United States. But then it moved on to the late 19th century to talk about how there were censorship acts, censorship activities to stop discussions about abolition, to stop discussions about obviously women getting the right to vote, about the passage of the 12th, 13th Amendment. And then eventually my focus became the 20th century, which is, how did the First Amendment basically become what it is today? Because we really didn't have what's considered free expression rights or free press rights like we do until the mid 1910s and the mid 1920s. And for the last basically a couple years, my focus has been on the 20th century. And now I would say, unfortunately, probably the now resurgence of institution, actors, laws, and what are called entrenchment mechanisms to try to stop the discussion of free expression, particularly for marginalized groups, because I'm really interested in something what's called horizontal communication. So in the history of free expression, people will always tell you that people in power love vertical communication because if you're in power, you control the newspapers, you can control the radios, you can control the TV. That's vertical. But horizontal communication is where marginalized folks begin to be able to make changes. And that's where I'm kind of disappointed and also interested as a historian that we're seeing some of the same themes. And so now back in 2023, we're seeing some of the same trends and resurgences that we saw in 400 BC, in 600 AD, in 1774, and now back in 2023. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see those trends in a bunch of different places, whether that's actual like spaces or movements or within like different time periods. So connecting this back, because I know you as somebody who works on with debaters and on the debate circuit, how does your work regarding horizontal communication and free expression apply to a space like speech and debate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it kind of takes me from like the armchair academic where I always was like reticent of being like, I'm talking about expression. Am I, actively helping facilitate it regardless of which side it's on? And I think to your point, my other hat that I wear is, as you mentioned, is the director of debate at a school down here in Anaheim, California. And the reason I joined debate and the reason I still love debate is because I sincerely believe, right, that it is, and sometimes folks criticize the metaphor, the marketplace of ideas. And I do understand the criticisms, one being that, there's folks who might have more access to the market. There's folks who have been removed or haven't been able to participate in the market. There's folks that are louder in the market. But I fundamentally believe, especially young people, need to see the value of the exchange of ideas. And regardless of whether that metaphor is reductive or redundant these days, I want to continue that project. And what I love about speech and debate is that it's ironically apolitical in the sense where even myself as a judge or you as a competitor that I have judged before, right? You are making arguments that could not agree with your political stances, but you're doing it because you think that hopefully it is the best form of the argumentation on one side. And I think that sort of skill set is really necessary in order to achieve social justice and other ends and goals. And like the famous Martin Luther King quote that Obama also took and kind of tweaked was like, the arc of history is long and it bends towards justice. So Obama kind of caveated and said, it doesn't bend towards justice inevitably. It bends because we are applying pressure over time. And I think debate is that pressure. And I think that's what's going to create justice over time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, speaking of like creating justice over time, you talk about free expression as something, that's inherently good and something that is the opposite of censorship and repression of minority voices. So, what is like censorship in your eyes, and how has that developed throughout history?
Yeah, great question. You could go back and what's again, I think like I mentioned before, which is kind of interesting, is like this is a cycle where,
Mhm.
go far back as you want to 400 BC when Socrates was poisoned because he was trying to challenge beliefs in Athens at the time. And you can go to Rome, like the creation of the word
Mhm.
censorship actually comes from a position in ancient Rome where the job of the censor was to basically identify obscenity, identify ideas that basically question the strength of the government. And this isn't just unique to the West, which I think is super interesting. In China, you had something called the Golden Shield Project. I mean, just imagine the idea of a golden shield, right? And this was from I believe it was the Chen dynasty, and it involved burning books, burying scholars literally to suppress their ideas. In ancient Persia, there was something called Eye of the King, and they were responsible for stopping communications that were disloyal to the king and the state. I mean, you can think of Galileo, and that's kind of like a really quick survey of censorship in a pre like 16th and 17th century because really you didn't really have anything to censor, right? There's this famous quote, and I have to pull it up. I think it's from Francis Bacon, and he said something like, when it comes to government and people being involved with the state, he said like something like, quote, these are not themes or subjects that are fit for vulgar persons or common meetings. So the irony is you really do have censorship, but it really becomes much more, I think, strong and apparent when you have the creation of the press, right? So I even have on my wall one of the oldest newspapers the English newspapers that's existed from like the late 19 no no late 17th century.
Mhm.
And it's basically a newspaper that says the king is great, the king is amazing, no one can question the king. And I have that on the wall to kind of show me the history of this. And for those who've studied like US history, studied English history, French history, the king or the monarch or the sovereign or the head of the state basically had a couple of controls when it comes to censorship. Our understanding of censorship comes from the idea of what's called prior restraint, which is the king or the queen, the monarch used to have to approve everything ahead of time, would give special licenses and basically subsidies or fees to those that didn't like or liked. And that was what it was like when press even started to begin, right? Over time, as we get into America, and people often say, actually, it's interesting that journalism and the spread of periodicals actually is pretty unique to the United States. And you had a bunch of this happening during the Revolutionary War, but people often think of the Stamp Act. So if you remember again to US history, there was a passage of the Stamp Act, and people forget really the point of the Stamp Act in the US Revolutionary War was to stop periodicals from being spread amongst the citizens. So, for example, Ben Franklin did this estimate. They said basically 50% of all periodicals probably had to stop circulating because of it, because people were debating and talking about it. But here's the funny part, Michi, is that the P articles, the newspapers were probably 2 to 1 for the war. I mean, for the revolution, meaning there was still dissent on the other side, which I think is fascinating that they didn't even want that debate to happen. And we could talk about the 19th century a little bit too, and slavery, and how there was literally states like South Carolina and Georgia that were passing acts that said you couldn't discuss anti-slavery movements because they were considered hostile. In After the Civil War, there was a journalist called Ida B. Wells who was writing about lynchings in 19th century the South, and she had literally a newspaper called the Free Speech, and it was burned by a mob. Right? So I think you start seeing this in the 19th century, and we'll talk a little about the 20th century maybe in a bit. But there's just like that's like a lot of 2,000 years of history. But notice the trend here, right? People in power do not like horizontal communication. They don't like the dissemination of information and knowledge because it prevents them from staying in power, especially as new emerging minority groups and marginalized groups come into power. And so that's a really quick history, I think, of censorship, maybe of the last 2,000 years.
That was very succinct. So you talk about how minority groups with like bold opinions are uniquely targeted by censorship and by people in power. How are they targeted in the first place? And how does this like cycle continue?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think we could use let's start with the 19th century because I start to see some parallels, and again with slavery. So you had something called gag rules, right? Like I mentioned, where it was like the prohibition of discovering anti-slavery petitions on the floor of Congress. So even in Congress, you weren't allowed to talk about it. I guess you could say like mob rule, right? So like mobs of pro-slavery individuals would gather to basically use something what's called the assassin's veto. And the assassin's veto come from a phrase where through the threat of intimidation and violence, you basically stop people from discussing materials. There's something else called the heckler's veto. And to be fair about the heckler's veto, I think it starts to be used differently in the 21st century, and you see different types of people using it. But the heckler's veto, and the word veto here, kind of like with the presidential vetoes, you're stopping something, right? So the
Mhm.
heckler's veto typically is you are not using violence, but you're disrupting events. You have the censorship of abolition, like literature, for example, like censorship literally saying you can't be found with books, pamphlets, or newspapers that are related to anti-slavery movements. And then lastly, like there was pro-slavery laws, right? So there was like laws enacted in, what did I say, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, etc., that basically said you can distribute, you couldn't meet because these were going to lead to revolutions and riots, right? So I think you
Mhm.
could see across the board intimidation, violence, laws, rules, and look how it's being done. Again, the idea being that those in power want to at least maintain their power, and the only way that they can probably do that in a lot of ways is to stop discussion. Because one of my favorite quotes, and we'll talk about it when we kind of get to the 20th century, is from Justice Brandeis, and he wrote in a 1913 article, and I actually have the original article in my apartment. Basically, he talks about what is the purpose of free speech, and he has this famous quote where he says, publicity is justly commended as a remedy for social and industrial diseases.
Mhm.
Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, electric light the most efficient policeman. So I think if you break that down, a remedy to social and industrial diseases, right? A remedy to social injustice, slavery, disenfranchisement, Jim Crow laws. If you think about it, like I think today is actually the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington.
Oh,
Like
wow.
people forget like that MLK had been restricted at several places from speaking from permits. He was being surveilled by the FBI. He was thrown in jail several times, right? So
Mhm.
this is something where continuously people who want to hold on to a certain asymmetrical power use laws, intimidation, other tactics in order to stop the discussion, because they're afraid if people see the sunlight, people see the merits and the information on both sides. In the case of Ida B. Wells, if people were aware of how many lynchings were occurring in the South at the time and how graphic they were, I mean,
Mhm.
think about the lynching of Emmett Till, right? What was the argument that his mom made about his casket being open, right? Her argument was the dissemination of the image of him in that casket with it open would change people's minds. And I think that it did.
Wow. Okay. So one of the barriers that you talked about to issues being talked about was kind of to simplify it a lot, people being talked over and mechanisms being introduced to prevent people from speaking out about important issues. Do you think that modern day mechanisms like the filibuster are also used to like repress minority voices?
Well, I mean, that's a great question because, the filibuster, if you remember some of the mid 20th century uses of it, some like people always talk about the records of like who set the record for the filibuster. Like we can't forget some of those records were set by Southern politicians who were resisting the passage of desegregation bills and civil rights bills. So it is absolutely true, right, that those kind of mechanisms or tools like the filibuster can be used. But the irony, though, here is that the filibuster is supposed to be a sort of minority, and I mean minority in the mathematical sense, a minority tool, which is that
Yeah.
that there are senators who don't have enough power, or representatives, and maybe even in a small, not even a small state, like even Texas. We all think about there was that female representative a couple years ago in Texas who was in her tennis shoes and was trying to advocate against anti-abortion laws in Texas. Like we can see arguments on both sides or examples on both sides of where it's being used to try to get information out there. And I'm not necessarily opposed to it because what it's trying to do is say, hey, listen to the argument that I'm trying to make. But then, of course, the irony is that it's been used in both different directions. So I
Yeah.
think it could go either way.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So you talk a lot about like censorship that occurs on a mass scale and is carried out by powerful entities, mainly like governments and stuff like that. Do you think that censorship, in like your definition of the word, can occur in day-to-day life?
For sure. And I think like when we get to, there's a concept in free expression called the chilling of speech.
Yeah.
which is that chilling, if you think about the word literally, right, is you feel cold, you feel icy, you don't move, you don't do something, right? So this
Mhm.
idea of chilling speech, right, is something like you mentioned, isn't just felt on the macro level, right? It's not something that's unique in that sense, where it's just done by, again, a macro level agent or entity like the US federal government saying they want to ban Slaughterhouse Five, right? It absolutely is something where, especially in the last, I think, 100 years, but it hasn't really entered the lexicon for the last 50 years, is a concept called self-censorship, where based on, again, not just the threat of a macro agent or a macro actor like the government, but maybe of your peers, right? That people end up self-censoring, that they don't speak out, they don't say something that is maybe they think in their interest. And that's definitely something that, now that we're talking about the 21st century, we have this concept of cancel culture, and where the term, and so I think the free speech debate becomes a little bit more interesting, because now I think both sides of the political aisle have seen examples or times when they felt like, for on one end of the spectrum, right, some folks believe the speech that Donald Trump was participating in on January 6th led to a riot, right? Led to a riot at the Capitol. On the
Mhm.
other end of the spectrum, right, we have folks who believe that, speech could be enticing folks out to go out there and to also commit acts of violence or criminality. So we have both sides now claiming that somehow speech is connected to violence, and I think
Mhm.
we can talk about that later on, or speech related to like acts, etc. But I do think that it is definitely the case that all of us can think of times in our lives where we've bit our tongue. And here's the thing, Michi, too, is like we're going to talk about it. There are a lot of bad ideas out there. There are a lot of atrocious ideas out there. There's a famous case from the UK in 2001 where a Holocaust denier sued a historian and said, "You have to prove to me, A, that the Holocaust happened, and B, that my representations were bad about it," right? And in
Mhm.
England, it's kind of a reverse burden of proof in libel and defamation cases, and we can get into the law later on. But it's basically, she had to go on the stand. And at one point, they were debating about whether to bring Holocaust deniers on the stand, and that's like the worst case possible case scenario you can imagine, where
Mhm.
people often say, free speech is perfect, it's great. And then and again, as someone who's such a proponent, I give them this. I think this is one of the worst case scenarios where I'm like, so you're telling me your 100-year-old grandmother should have to go up there and debate is
Yeah.
basically what they were doing, debate a Holocaust denier and say, no, I was at Auschwitz. And
Mhm.
that's just an example, again, maybe again on the higher level, but that's where things start to get a little tricky, which I think is interesting. So
Yeah. So this self-censorship that you talk about, which group, like in which group does this occur most? And like kind of what setting, where does this occur the most?
again, from my historical perspective first, like remember what I talked about in terms of the assassin's veto and the heckler's veto, is that
Mhm.
you had women, you had folks that were, queer in the 1950s, you had folks who were abolitionists in the 19th century who were first self-censoring. Now when we come to the 21st century, I think this is where things become interesting, which is, you know I think censorship got better in terms of folks not using, the assassin's veto or the heckler's veto, or there was obviously legal limitations from a government perspective from you being harmed. But one of the distinctions I always like to make about the First Amendment, and most folks know this, but it's important to point out, is the First Amendment only protects you from the government, right? It does
Mhm.
not protect you from censorship from private actors. And one of the things I always like to remind people is that I think that there are some issues that come about because of cancel culture, but at the same time, cancel culture is speech. Cancel culture is us using speech to react to speech. Now, does that mean, and we can go into it to talk about what are the repercussions, but sometimes people forget when someone says something that you think is offensive, right? When you say someone says something that is objectively racist, right? There is a difference between the government reacting to it and you reacting to it. So can you counter that speech? Now there's a debate in terms of, should you become a heckler's veto and like stop these controversial speakers from speaking? And that's where it kind of becomes, I think, a really tricky situation. But I do want both sides to think about this, because I always frustrate everyone, because I try to find like the most, I think, nuanced position, which is there are limitations to cancel culture when it goes too far, But there's also that cancel culture also is part of free expression, which is we're using speech to respond to other speech. So I do think now that we are in the 21st century, there is a lot of questions, and even in debate, which we'll probably get to very specifically, is where people begin to self-censor. And it used to be on things that were on the periphery, right? Like I mentioned, like how many Holocaust deniers do we see out there? And some people would say, great, they should be self-censoring. But now, as we get into sort of the self-censorship that's happening more often, it's even questioning, for example, like if you even question that US government can be good, some people say like the government is inherently evil and you should like not be talking about it. On the other end of the spectrum, it's as if people can't even criticize the US government. So you have both sides now. Now there's this sort of new position where everyone feels very careful about what they're saying. And I have questions about whether that's good for discourse.
Okay, so this position that we're kind of in now, with like cancel culture and everybody being very like careful to either not state strong opinions or just stay away from extremes, do you think that there's anything that we can do to break this up and increase productive discourse about like social issues?
Yeah, and I think, it's difficult because some people, and again, there was that adage I mentioned, which is the best remedy to speech is more speech. But
Mhm.
then you have the most extreme examples, which are like, again, Holocaust denial. I mean, there was this sort of, this famous people debate where people say, we should debate climate change, even though 99.9% of scientists think there's a consensus. So I think like the one thing is you have to ask yourself, debate is, I think, virtuous. It's a good thing, right? But if you start a debate with someone that has a position that is a non-starter, meaning one that is not founded in any source of truth or fact, that debate is impossible to have with to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So when you have a Holocaust denial debate, right, people say debate's good, right? They say, Rusk, you think debate's good, so you should debate about the Holocaust being not true, right? No, because you can have a debate, a discourse about something that is fundamentally untrue. And here's where it gets tricky. Then people say, what is true? Right. So then people say, well, how do we determine what is true? And that's where it gets fundamentally difficult, right? Holocaust, obviously very easy, right? Climate change, I think is easy, but some people don't think is easy, right? And then you get into different questions about if you can't have an agreeing point of what is where you start from a point of truth, right? That is going to become, I think, difficult. And I'll have to send it to you and for the listeners later, there's this new debate style that was introduced on YouTube that I thought was really interesting, where they brought two experts together
Mhm.
on the opposite side of the spectrums. And the first episode was about assisted suicide in Canada. And they said, let's can you agree to these 10 points in common? And they would have a discussion about these 10 points of fact. So
Mhm.
that this is the first fact, this is the second fact, this is the third fact, this is the, and then they would go through them and maybe they would agree to 8 out of 10 of them. And then
Yeah.
from that, they agreed to the baseline facts. Then they would have a discussion. And I found it to be the most interesting style of debate I've ever seen because there really then became less of like your evidence is wrong, you're starting from a bad position of bad faith, etc. Because they started on a foundation that was the same. So I think that's a cool approach. And I think if we start from a data set, we start from premises that are at least obviously true, I think then we can have maybe some more legitimate discussions.
Okay, so how can those kinds of discussions where we establish like common ground between people or between groups who disagree about an issue, how can that happen in the real world rather than just in like a simulated environment?
True, absolutely. And as a queer person, if you told me that I had to sit down and debate with someone who
Mhm.
thinks that, anyone who's LGBTQ is either, sinful or perverted or associated with pedophilia,
Mhm.
right? It's in these some of the conversations that people say is like, how could you make me have a debate or discussion with someone who one probably won't agree to any fundamental truths, but two, right, in the real world, they're not going to sit down and establish 10 true facts with me, right? They're not going to say,
Yeah.
all humans are equal. We have the same, propensity for cognition and dignity, et cetera. So you're right. And I think like my approach to that is, I mean, they've done these sort of empathy studies where they throw, a bunch of folks together that have really unlike things. And I think this one's a little less simulated, but it still kind of is. They're not experts, but they throw them together in a room and say, what can we find that we do have in common? And if I were to talk to someone who has a position on homosexuality or being gay or being queer, and I would say, hey, where does this come from? Can we talk about like a root cause? Maybe it comes from a position of faith, right? And I'm a Buddhist, and we can say, hey, like I am a Buddhist who believes in these sort of tenets of Buddhism, which have to do with the, destruction of the ego, eliminating pain and suffering. And I'm like, well, Jesus maybe also had some of these things in common. So I think it's finding commonalities and finding maybe common denominators, and then we'll never come to the same position. But if I can create empathy, if I create the ability for them to see me also as human, maybe even if I don't change their mind, maybe I've opened them up to at least listening. And I think if people start to listen, that's better than nothing.
Definitely. And I think that not only is, for me, not only is free expression like the act of being able to express whatever you want, it's the act, it's being able to be like heard and listened to by other people who like you're trying to reach out to about these issues. So
Mhm.
you talk about establishing empathy and finding commonalities, which is like a great concept for talking about issues with other people. Do you think that this can be applied on a wider scale, for example, like in our governments with larger social movements and issues? If so, how?
Absolutely. And I think like I'll give you an example with there's a current trend for book bans, right? And
Mhm.
again, speaking of history, this isn't new. There was a bill in the 19th century in the US called the Comstock Act, which said, you can't discuss literature about abortion or uh birth control, right? There were bills that says you couldn't discuss, legislation about slavery, right? And in the 20th century, we ironically tried to some school districts or some governments tried to limit Fahrenheit 451, right? So again, trends happening again. But think about this, right? There are these bills that are being passed in states that says if your book or your material is overly obscene, if it meets these certain parameters, we have to take it out. First of all, the Supreme Court has had cases about this since the 1980s that have already set rules about it. So I think it's absurd to begin with. But B, the irony ended up being that one of the groups who were opposed to it used the law to end up banning the Bible, right? And I think if you start finding where they said, look, if you talk about obscenity and violence, here are all of the passages that we think are obscene. And the other side was pointing out like Toni Morrison's books, Kurt Vonnegut's books, even like really, really, I think clearly unobscene books were categories obscene. We said, hey, and they call this the gatekeeper approach in free expression discussions, which is imagine the person that is most ideologically different from you.
Mhm.
Imagine that they had control over your children's television and your children's library, right? So they were now the ones controlling. If you feel uncomfortable about that position, right, today you're the one that's gatekeeping for you and what you believe is to be true. But then tomorrow I might get in power and make that opposite position. So I think on the government level, showing people these examples of where like, there was a famous phrase about obscenity in the 1960s and 70s by Justice Potter when he said, "I know it when I see it." But the irony is like, what is it? What is it to you? And we do have a definition under what's called the Miller test, and it's very legalese and all that stuff. But if it's so broad and it's so vague, right? Again, people in power will abuse it to their ends. And this goes both ways. There is political censorship on both sides of the aisle, right? I think, there's this sort of big discussion, especially on university campuses, where they think that it's the left that's censoring, right? The left that's shouting down speakers and preventing them from happening. And then obviously, and again, we could talk about the empirics of that regardless. But then on the right, right, there's the argument that there's book bans happening. And I think both sides should embrace the thought experiment of the gatekeeper, which is think about the person who's your opposite politically. Do they have control over your kid's television? And if you like that, that's great. But I'm guessing you don't. So let's create rules where it's not just because who's in power does it. And I think if you talk about it like that, you'll find common ground with folks who believe that free expression is good on both sides.
Definitely. So a lot of the laws or like kind of precedents or acts that you cited
Mm.
um, talk about like obscenity and stuff like that as means for banning literature, banning material, especially for kids in educational settings. How do you think our protection of our own comfort and our subjective ideas about obscenity prevent social change and lead to censorship?
Absolutely. And I think I want to start with the best argument that I have to struggle with oftentimes, which is it is true in PTSD studies
Mhm.
of folks who've experienced trauma that there are catalytic events that cause them to relive it. And we have MRIs, we have physiological evidence that people do feel adverse effects that can be very painful and very harmful to them based on certain scenarios, right?
Yeah.
So the idea that I think you presented one, which is a difficult one, which is like obscenity originally was, I think, about controlling basically power. Then I do think that there were religious and racial motivations behind it, which it was like we don't want people to change their ideas about what is family, what is gender, what is sexuality, what is good governance, right? And it did shift right now to this theory of discomfort, which is that if it's causing, well, obscenity really started out with focusing on children and women with this infantilizing idea that they couldn't obviously approach difficult subjects because their ethers, their limited capacity as it was conceptualized in the 19th century wasn't sufficient. Obviously, we know that it's 100% untrue, etc. Now, in the 20th century, as that began to change, it was still the idea of like we don't want people to have to see explicit material because it will harm them. And this is
Mhm.
kind of what I alluded to before, which is I have a very on one hand of the spectrum, like I started off, there is physiological evidence that there are folks, and we're not denying the fact that this is their maybe personal phenomenological experience, that there
Mhm.
are folks that feel discomfort when they hear certain things or see certain things. But two things. One, I think we have to begin to be careful when we associate speech with causing physical harm and harm in general. Because if you begin to do that, you get to the trap that we started out in the 20th century, which was everyone's probably heard the famous phrase, you should never shout fire in a crowded theater, right? Everyone's heard this phrase. And the idea was it actually comes from a case, a Supreme Court case, where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was making the argument, most people don't know this, that we should stop anti-war protesters and socialists from distributing pamphlets because it was harming the U.S. War effort. So the original phrase that people use all the time to this day, even there's a Twitter tracker that finds every time it's being used. It's used by politicians all the time. Is that speech leads to discomfort and harm. And that was the original argument, that if it led to discomfort and harm, in this case, an imminent threat or danger under Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, that we should stop it, right? It's not just obscenity, but it's other things. That case was overturned later on in a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio, and it became a little bit more technical, thankfully. There's a lot more prongs to it. But I think that gets to your point where when speech is associated with discomfort and harm, and that we should avoid it because of that, one, we have to be very careful when we start going down the route, which is why people are surprised to hear when I tell people that I think that, if you begin to say things like Donald Trump's speech incited violence and the riots on January 6th, think about the equivalent. There's a case going through the Fifth Circuit right now about a Black Lives Matter movement leader. And because he asked people to march, because he asked people to go, I think it was on part of a thoroughfare in some part of Texas, right? And eventually that crowd broke up into small groups, and part of that group ended up committing violence and maybe breaking, I think, something at some point. There was a legal case, and the Fifth Circuit's debating it, which is crazy to think about, that Black Lives Matter protest leader, because he started that conversation, is now tangibly connected to the harm that comes later on. Now, where that gets to us, our question today about discomfort, it's again objectively something I can't disprove, that people don't feel discomfort. I do want to point out, and something that we can obviously send out to people that are interested, there was a meta-analysis that was released just last week
Mhm.
about something that we're going to talk about, I think, which is content warnings and trigger warnings.
Yeah.
And it looked over 407 different studies. And I was going into it objectively. I was going to say, no matter what happens with the results, I'm going to look into it. It found that the studies from that 407 subset, were a little limited, so it had to narrow it down. But it basically confirmed what is almost, a pretty large consensus now in peer-reviewed material, that this idea that trigger warnings, that speech leads to harm, that could be possibly true, but also that trigger warnings create what's called, or content warnings create what's called a nocebo effect or a boomerang effect, which is that once you're told that there's going to be a trigger warning, that actually creates sometimes more discomfort objectively, actually causes
Mhm.
more discomfort than the content itself. So I think it's true. I just gave you an example of where speech, in this case, a content warning, led to discomfort, but it was actually ironically telling you to watch out for the speech that you thought was going to make you uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
I think we just have to be careful, because if we start to say we can't have conversations because of discomfort, that's the same argument that was being used in the 19th century to stop discussions about slavery. It's the same argument that was used to stop conversations about enfranchisement. It was the same conversations to stop talking about, the AIDS movement. There was basically, a blanket policy that we couldn't, depict certain acts, certain art pieces, certain aspects of the AIDS movement in the late 1880s because it was obscene, etc. So I'm hesitant and I'm careful that when we start saying because something causes discomfort, we can't have that conversation. So a solution that, again, I think we're going to talk about that people created was content warnings. But I think, again, we just have to be careful about it. So I just say, let's just think about what happens when we begin to associate speech with harm, because that was the original reason that we tried to stop people from protesting against war.
Yeah. With content warnings, it's definitely difficult because you bring up the fact that a lot of people genuinely can be re-traumatized by certain stimuli and stuff like that. So how do we where do we draw the line? How can we respect people's traumas or certain triggers while at the same time not leading to this boomerang effect?
Yeah, and I think that it's from a different scales, different perspectives. So I think starting from the university classroom, right? I think providing content warnings, again, the meta study suggests that it does actually create an anticipatory effect where it does actually make people have more of a negative outcome. But regardless of that, that does give people agency and choice. And I think that's sort of the best middle ground solution, which is, one, I don't know if you should require teachers to have to provide content warnings, but you should also not prohibit them and also not, get mad at folks who don't provide them, right? So if you think this is something that is going to give people agency and choice, I think that's great. On the other end of the spectrum, you have to be careful, right? Because if you start giving those trigger warnings for anything, that could create, I think, some issues. And I'll give you an example specific to debate where, I on my paradigm, for those that don't know in debate, you write a paradigm. I have a lot of stuff, but I spend a lot of time talking about trigger warnings because my experience with them in debate was that, I there was teams that were running it because that there was very graphic discussions that were happening within the literature, often sometimes to do with feminism, with human trafficking, with sexual assault. And they included them because they were graphic. And there's some studies that obviously suggest that the more detailed it is, the more likely that's going to happen. But over time, my worry began to happen where if there was any mention of something that was related to feminism, that was a negative, right? A disadvantage. People would say, well, why didn't you read a trigger warning? And then they run theory. And in theory being in this case, a theoretical argument, you should lose the round because you didn't introduce it. And I have screenshots of text messages of males from another team saying, oh, we ran this, so we didn't want to have to debate the actual issue because we didn't think we could win. And so then the solution was, well, we'll create opt-outs, anonymous opt-outs where anyone can opt out, which again is trying to give people choice, which is great. But then I also have knowledge of debaters who have told me explicitly, well, yeah, we're always going to opt out because we don't want to have to debate those issues, especially against women and girls. So it's such a hard position because on one hand, you cannot deny someone's subjective experience and say that they are not feeling this way. But it's finding that middle ground where you give people agency and choice, where you shouldn't. My middle ground that I came upon was that I'm never going to punish anyone for not including a trigger warning. But if you'd like to, you can encourage it and you can use it. And that was sort of my resolution in the debate space. In the university space, kind of the similar solution.
That makes a lot of sense. So for students that are looking to get their voices heard, especially about issues that relate to their subjective experiences or just anything that's important to them, like feminism, like you mentioned, how can they do this while staying within the middle ground of being able to talk about their issue in a way that gets people's attention while also respecting the agency of other people in whatever space they're in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to, this is tough because if you go back to like the example I mentioned with Emmett Till, right, of having to show the casket, like that is one of the most graphic, but obviously in like burn images in my head. And the point of it was to obviously make a movement for people to respond. Even after the Sandy Hook shooting back in 2000, oh gosh, is it the 10-year anniversary? It might have been 10 years ago now, where there was an argument to be made that we shouldn't have restricted the release of the photos because we thought that could lead to speech. But the same side of the coin, which is, think about all the Black Americans in this country, all of the folks who have experienced racial violence, right? On one hand, we need to find solutions and change it. Maybe this would motivate people, but there are those who have seen those images, seeing that content, hearing even those words in a debate space can obviously be difficult. So I think like, on one hand, I get that visceral experiences change people's minds, but the question is, are you doing it gratuitously? Are you doing it to achieve a certain end at any means? And I think what you have to do is be like, how far can we go to make that impact feel heard? And maybe it's not necessarily reading the exact words of an incident. Maybe it's not going to details of what happened to someone, but maybe not obviously undermining the statistical merit of what happened. So instead of maybe having the ethnographic experiences of women who've experienced sexual assault being quoted in your speech, you talk about the scale of the problem, how many people are affected. So you still have that emotional weight to the argument where you're not, because what I don't want you to do is to gloss over it, right? I don't want you to do is to undermine the scale of the argument, but you need to sort of find that balancing act. And if it can't be from that sort of graphic, visceral perspective, it can also be from the scale of hopefully data or evidence. And I think that's where you can still make the emotional appeal that I think is sometimes necessary to convince people of something. And I hope that's a way of doing it without maybe necessarily making people connect it to their own, relative subjective experience.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. On an even wider scale than what we talk about in debate and then what like individual activists talk about, whether it's like online, on social media, stuff like that, how can activists and people who are advocating for a movement get their message across even when they are in fear of being censored, especially by powerful actors like the government?
Absolutely. And I think that we are lucky today that we don't have some of the inhibitions slash barriers. So like again, the example I gave was always the Soviet Union, which is they loved vertical communication, announce something on the radio, announce something on TV, no newspapers, telephone lines were actually always channeled through Moscow so they could listen to it. So the good news is that we don't necessarily have those limitations. So we're in a good position when we start without those barriers. With the advent of social media, with the advent of social media plus protest movements, if you think about, people sometimes don't grasp the international nature of the Black Lives Matter protests. Where, I was in England 2 years after they basically became very popular. And 2 years after that when they even became even more strong. And this was a movement that seemed that it was like basically starting in Central America, of the center of the United States and the east coast of America, but then spread. And now, when I was in England, everyone knew what the BLM movement was. And I think especially now with social media and the advent of what Justice Brandeis called, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The first most important thing is that everybody has access to the appropriate information and knowledge. And then we get to advocacy. So the first most important thing is like one of my most important parts of what I do is like we have to start with making sure everyone has access to the right knowledge, which is like that's why body cameras are good for both police and folks on the streets, right? That's why we have basically what are called FOIA laws, which are Freedom of Information Act requirements, where we can get information from the government. We have what are called anti-SLAPP laws in a lot of states, which prevents people from basically suing you for defamation for very frivolous reasons. So we start with that, which is we have to have the collective information. We have to have the footage. And there's a lot of people that argue we shouldn't have to see the footage of George Floyd is graphic, right? Literally 7, 8, 9 minutes, right? But we have to start from that position of a common informational touchstone. But then we say, look, you have the information. You have George Floyd's video. You have the video of, there was an example over the summer of this Oklahoma or Kansas, I can't remember exactly which state it was, sheriff who was caught on recording saying we have to, like, literally he said something like lynch or kill a journalist because they're messing with my job, etc. And we start with that information, then you could say point to it and say this is the thing that is wrong, this is the problem, this is the sunlight showing on the disease, and then we can begin to advocate. So in the wake of George Floyd, right, in the wake of BLM, right, more cameras on the streets, we realized, more community policing reform, more discussions with stakeholders on the ground. So you have to start with that position. And the second thing, like I said, it's like is finding common stakeholders, because I think even if you ask police officers when it comes to cameras on body cameras, it's like it's also in their interest. So finding those commonalities, saying, look, there's an issue that we have found, right, which is we think that there's oftentimes systemic disproportionate use of force, and you also don't want that, right? You want training, you want legal protection, you want to do the job that you believe in, that you think is good for safety, etc. And finding that commonality, I think, is really important. And I think BLM is proof of this, where you have this movement now that is its own on its own. It used to obviously be a corporation, a nonprofit, whatever, but now it is spread to something much more. So I think the steps that advocates need are get the information out there and then discuss what the implications of the evidence are, and then find common ground between you. And we can start there. I'm a believer in incrementalism. I think it's hard for the pendulum to swing. It's hard for the arc of history to bend really quickly because it will snap. So I think anything we can do, I think incremental change. Some people say it takes too long. Sometimes that's all we can do.
I think that that is a great message, and I think that that's very encouraging, especially since a lot of other things outside of activism are evolving to like kind of facilitate the spread of this information, like social media and the rapid spread of information. So overall, thank you so much for being on this podcast. Thank you for your time. I learned a lot. I learned a lot about history today, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you having this conversation. And the meta-ness of this is that because of this, I hope people have better conversations. And like I said, everyone, sunlight is the best disinfectant.